Hey guys, and a very good morning to you all. It is so good to be with you and an amazing privilege to have the opportunity to share with you guys today. Before we dive into the message this morning, I thought it's the polite thing for me to do is to introduce myself rather than having a complete stranger talk to you. So my name is Pete. I live in beautiful Manchester with my wife Lauren, where we lead a church together. I have a 1-year-old called India who is just full of beans. She's just learned to walk these past couple of months, and she is full of beans every minute of every day. She's brilliant. And then there's the fourth member of our crew, our little sausage dog, Graham, who most people think is pretty cute. But don't let the cuteness fool you. I mean, we're really not friends at the moment. He's got some pretty bad habits that I just can't train out of him. And one of them is that he has no loyalty when it comes to food. And you know that phrase like, stealing candy from a baby? That's exactly what Graham does. He's constantly stealing my daughter's food. And his other bad habit is that he hates the postman, and so every bit of post that comes through the door just gets destroyed. And so yesterday I discovered this soggy, torn up package by a front door with some fruity liquid all over the carpet. It turns out I'd ordered some baby shampoo from Amazon, and turns out Graham's got a taste for baby shampoo, and so we're not friends because he's made a mess of my carpet and the shampoo. But anyway, that's my crew, and for some reason you know more about my dog than you do about me, but here goes. So this weekend we're diving into the story of the Exodus. Now, next to the story of Jesus, like, the Exodus is the big story of the Bible. I mean, for Jewish people, the people in the Old Testament, it is the defining story in their history. It's the defining moment of their faith and their identity as the people of God. And whilst it is an amazing story in and of itself, it points to something greater than just that one event, or to be more precise, it points to someone greater, and that, of course, is Jesus. So one of my passions is playing the drums, and when I was growing up, I used to have my drum kit set up in my room, and I was really fortunate that we didn't have any neighbours, and my parents were pretty tolerant at the incessant noise that kept coming from my room. Now, lots of people say that drummers aren't always the brightest bunch and don't always have a lot of common sense, which isn't true. If you're a drummer, we need to stand up for each other, right? Most of the time, anyway, I'd say that. But I must admit that there was one occasion when I let the side down a little bit. In fact, I don't even know why I'm telling this story, but I'll tell it you anyway. So one Saturday morning, I was a little bit bored, decided to spend some time on the drums, and I was playing away, and all of a sudden I took notice of my bass drum, which is the big round one that you hit with your foot. And then in the front of the bass drum is this kind of smallish hole about this big that you sometimes put a microphone in. And I was playing away, and I have no idea why, but I suddenly thought, I bet I can get my head in there. And so, being the wise person that I am, and being a little bit bored as well, I gave it a go. Now, I tell you, it wasn't an easy fit, but my head just about made it through this hole. And then when I did, I had this brief moment of kind of, woohoo, I've done it. And then I admired the inside of my bass drum before backing out. But what I hadn't taken into account was, it's all very well to get your head into a small hole like that, because when you squeeze it in, your ears go flat against your head. But it doesn't work coming out the other way, and I was stuck, and I mean properly stuck, and there was nothing that I could do to get free. And I tried forcing my head out, but the plastic on the drum was like cutting into my ears, and apart from losing my ears, I realised I actually needed help. Like, I couldn't get myself free. But the problem was I was too embarrassed to like shout for help. But at the end of the day, I had no choice. And the problem was, my dad, who was he was downstairs with his music blasting, and my head was in a confined space. And when you're yelling in a confined space and you can't cover your ears, it's not pleasant. But I kept shouting and shouting, and no one came. And so I began to kick the floor instead, hoping that my dad would eventually hear me. 20 minutes I was stuck before my dad eventually heard me, and I remember him walking up the stairs, hearing his footsteps, and as he arrived in my room, I heard him say, "What have you done?" Now, I couldn't see his face, but the voice that I heard didn't sound like the voice of love and compassion. In fact, it was more like disappointment at my stupidity. But eventually, my daddy got some scissors, and he eventually cut me out. And there, a valuable life lesson was learned. Never stick your head in the hole of the bass drum. Now, I tell you that story, not just to make myself look stupid, but I wonder if you've ever encountered those moments in your life when you just feel stuck, either physically, emotionally, mentally. You find yourself in a situation and you just want out. You think, I don't want to be here. I don't want to live like this. But however hard you try, however hard you long for it, you just feel stuck and you feel trapped and you're just desperate to find a way out. In the story of the Exodus, God's people are suffering. I mean, they've been enslaved for about 400 years and there just seems no way out of their situation. Now we get the benefit of reading the whole story and we know what happens in the end. We know how it all ends. God has a rescue plan for his people and it all works itself out. But for a moment, just try and imagine that you don't know how the story ends. I mean, God's people hadn't always been the underdog. They hadn't always been slaves. The truth was, I mean, they'd been destined for greatness at the beginning of their story. I mean, at the beginning of their history, God had made this promise that they were going to be a mighty nation, that God was going to use them to bless all the other nations of the world. But the reality was, this great nation found themselves as slaves in Egypt, serving one of the most ruthless and cruel empires that the world has ever seen. And there they were basically property. They were owned by someone else. They served masters who worked them tirelessly, day in, day out. And every day that they went to work, if they were ever to remember God's promise to them or have the slightest hope that things could ever change, then the lashes on their backs and the beatings would remind them that they were slaves and that's all they would ever be. I mean, they had no sense of identity, no value, no rights, no freedom, and no hope. And here's the thing, however hard that the Israelites worked, I mean, however much they built and fulfilled the demands of their taskmasters, however well they did, it was just never enough to earn their freedom. And I think for us today, we don't have the injustice, as many in our world do, of living as slaves, but there's a lot of things that have control of our lives that in some way we can be slaves to. And I know that yesterday you looked at how things like the demands of technology and social media can have control over us and our behavior, and we could say that we are slaves to those things. And I think for God's people and for us today that we can also become slaves to our thoughts. Because you see, what goes on in your mind can have so much control over us to the point where we begin to lose a sense of our true identity of who God created us to be. Let me explain. So in the 1970s, a group of psychologists conducted some experiments to prove this long thought theory that they called the illusory truth effect. Now, the title doesn't matter, but these experiments were basically trying to prove the idea that when a lie is repeated enough, or when a person is given like misinformation, the wrong information over and over, that people will eventually start to believe it's true. And so I remember as a kid, my parents would often say to me, Pete, don't sit too close to the TV or you'll get square eyes, which you laugh at now, but I used to hear it over and over again. And as a kid, I was convinced it was true. I mean, I wear glasses and I believed it was because I sat too close to the TV. You see, for God's people, they've been slaves for so long, every day being told that they're the property of someone else, every day being stuck in the same cycle, so much so that they had started to believe is that a slave would all they would ever amount to. There'd never be anything more. And then what God had promised about them being a great nation, I mean, that was a load of rubbish. I mean, however hard they tried, they couldn't get themselves free. They were stuck. And this is where we jump in the story in Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire and it didn't burn up, so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their great suffering. If you ever had those moments when it feels like God is deaf, maybe you've prayed for something, maybe you've asked God to intervene in a situation, maybe to heal someone, to give you guidance, or just to put an end to a situation, but it's like you've been met with silence. I mean, I've been there a lot. But I love this passage because it reminds us that every prayer that you've prayed, every moment of pain and heartbreak and sadness, every cry for justice, God sees it and He feels it and He hears you and He cares and His heart is breaking with you. I mean, hear me on this. I don't always understand God's timing or why He does things the way that He does. I mean, Israel have been waiting and crying out for so long. But the truth is, God hears them and He cares, and then He acts. And then in verse 8, God says this, So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. I love this. I mean, in Israel's lowest moment, when it seems that they'll be stuck as slaves forever, when there seems no hope and no way out, God says, I have heard you. I feel your pain. He sees the fact that however hard they work, however desperate they are to be free, they cannot free themselves. And here we see in this moment of divine intervention where God steps into the picture. And rather than stay distant somewhere up there in heaven, God comes close. And I love that verse 8, it says, I have come down to rescue them. And that bit about the land flowing with milk and honey, this is basically God reminding His people, I've not forgotten what I promised you all those years ago. Not only am I going to come and rescue you, but I'm going to make good on my promises, and you will be a great nation because you are my people. I'm going to remind you of who you are and who you were made to be. And God, He steps into the picture and He sets this plan in motion to free His people in the most spectacular way. So I wonder, if I ask you the question, who are you, or what makes you you, I wonder what you'd say. I mean, at the beginning I introduced myself. I told you my name, I told you about my family, the fact that I play the drums, that I lead a church for a job, and all these things are so important to me and some of the most defining things of my life. But let me ask you this, if any of those things were taken away from me, if I lost my job, if I were unable to play the drums, would it lessen my worth or my value as a person? I mean, of course it doesn't. But if I listen to the voices that would say, Pete, you're a failure, Pete, you have no prospects, no future, no one likes you, you can't do anything right, your life's a mess. If I kept listening to those voices, then I would eventually start to believe them. I mean, hear me on this. That your identity, your worth and your value is not based on the things that you do or do not do in this life. Success in life, however that looks for you, doesn't give you a greater value or worth as a person. In the same way, your failures and your flaws don't give you any less value, whatever the world might say or think about you. I mean, so much of our world bases a person's value on what they do or do not do. I mean, if you think of someone like Lionel Messi or Beyonce, they're like the most successful people in their fields, right? And they're defined by their value, which comes from their success. But the opposite is also true. I mean, people can often be defined or devalued by their flaws and their mistakes. I mean, just look at how the media jumps all over celebrities when they mess up, when they make mistakes, and they shame them to the whole world. Guys, I need you to know this today, that your identity is not based on what you do or do not do in this life. Your identity is based on the person that made you, who knows you, who loves you. Your identity is based in who God says you are and who He created you to be. You know, apart from Jesus, every person who has ever walked the earth and whoever will set foot on this earth are all affected by the same condition that we call sin. And it simply means to fall short of God's best, to miss the mark, and at some point we all fall short. We make mistakes, we say or we do the wrong things, we get into really bad habits or cycles of behavior where we hurt ourselves or other people. And the problem with sin is that it feels like this repetitive cycle. I mean, I can say hand on heart that I don't want to sin. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to be a selfish person or say or do the wrong things or hurt anyone. And I try so hard to live right and do right and to be a good person. But even as a church leader, as a human being, however hard I try, I just end up messing up, and I feel like I make the same mistakes over and over, and however hard I try, I just can't seem to stop it. I can't seem to escape the cycle of sin, and it leads to these feelings of shame and guilt, or a sense that I'm not good enough, or that God can never use me, and then the cycle just begins again, and it's like I'm a slave to being a screw up. I just can't seem to change my behavior. And I wonder for us, what happens when the loudest voices in our lives are the ones that beat us down, that make us feel so small? What happens when other people value us on the basis of what we have or haven't done? Maybe your mistakes or your flaws or your failures. When the voices say that we're not good enough, that we won't amount to anything, that no one likes you. Maybe they're not even the voices of other people. Maybe those voices are the things that we say about ourselves. And when we hear these voices, or when we think these thoughts enough, we can start to believe that they're true, and we start to believe a lie. And maybe for some people who are listening and watching this today, you carry maybe a deep sense of shame, either because of what other people say about you, or just how you think about yourself. I mean, maybe your self-esteem or your confidence is on the floor because you just struggle to feel any sense of worth or value because of what you've done or have not done, or what other people say about you. I mean, maybe your mind is just flooded with anxiety and worry or insecurity and fear. Or maybe like me, at times you just feel like you're a constant disappointment to God and to those around you, and you wonder, how could God ever love me, let alone use me? And if you've ever felt like that, number one, you're not alone. But let me say this: don't ever believe a lie that you are no more than the product of your actions or the circumstances going on around you. There is a way out, and there is freedom, and there is hope. So fast forward a couple of thousand years, and the events of the Exodus are long gone, but surprise, surprise, despite what God did in the Exodus, humanity are still in this repetitive cycle. They're still slaves to sin, and just like in the Exodus, God sees it, and he sees the brokenness and the pain of his people, and he decides to step in. Only this time, God didn't just come down to fix one moment in history. He came down this time to fix every moment in history once and for all. And we see this greatest moment of divine intervention that the world has ever seen. And you see, the problem with sin is that no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to break free from it. So how do we break the cycle? Well, the answer is we don't. In the book of John, chapter 1, we read this moment of divine intervention where God came to earth as a person. It said, like, he put on flesh and blood and he became one of us. In one translation, it says he moved into the neighborhood. He made his home here. God living among us. You know, one of the problems with sin, or the problem with sin, it doesn't just cause hurt and pain to us and other people. It actually separates us from God. We cannot have relationship with the God who made us with sin in the way. I mean, the Bible says it like this: the consequence for our sin is death. But the trouble is, humanity has never had a way to get rid of it. I mean, people in the Old Testament, they used to offer sacrifices which would pay the penalty for your sin, for that particular sin. But if you sinned again, then you'd have to sacrifice again and again and again. The cycle was repetitive. There was no once and for all solution for sin until Jesus came. I mean, he lived among us, and he lived his life perfect. He loved and he cared and gave his life for people. And unlike you and me, he didn't give in to temptation and sin. You know, the only way to fix sin was to make amends, was for something to die in your place. Only this time, it wasn't an animal sacrifice. Jesus paid the price for your sin with his life. Now, you're going to go deeper in this tonight, but I just want to say this as we finish. God thought that you were so valuable that you were worth dying for. And he died the cruelest, the most painful death on the cross. You know, Roman crucifixion was considered one of the most painful and cruelest ways to die. And you know, as Jesus hung on the cross, he took all the sin of the world, all the guilt, all the shame, the inadequacy, the mistakes, all the brokenness of the world. He took it all on himself in that moment. And as he died, he took it all to the grave. And here's the best thing about it. He left it there. He left all the mess and the pain in the grave, and he rose again as a sign to sin that sin, you have no hold on me or anyone who trusts in what Jesus has done and who Jesus is. Jesus broke the cycle. Sin doesn't have a hold on you. There is freedom. There's forgiveness. You don't have to live as a slave to sin because Jesus has paid it all. Yes, we still make mistakes and mess up, but there is freedom and forgiveness through what Jesus has done, so we don't have to live with the guilt or the shame or this false sense of identity that I'm not good enough. You don't have to believe the lie that defines you, that you're a slave to sin, that you will never amount to more than what you have done. But because Jesus was perfect, guess what? It meant the payment was permanent. He set you free. He set you free from all the things that weigh us down and that break us, and he's given you a new identity as a child of God. You are his, you are loved, you are forgiven, you're free, you're his masterpiece. And tell you what, guys, he has amazing plans for your life, and you know what? There's nothing you could ever do that will change that. And this freedom and this forgiveness, this new life, it is available for everyone, for you and for me. And all you have to do is put your trust in Jesus and believe in what he's done for you, that it has power to change and transform your life. And I think, as I close, that today, I think that Jesus wants to set some people free. Maybe today you're struggling and you just feel like you've hit rock bottom. Your identity and your self-worth just feels non-existent, that you feel like I'm just a slave to the opinions of other people or the things that I believe about myself. Do you know what? That is not true. And Jesus died so you didn't have to feel like that, so you didn't have to carry the weight of that shame and that guilt and that feeling of inadequacy. And I believe this morning Jesus wants to set you free and experience the love and the purpose that he has for you. So if you're feeling like that, I would love to pray for you in this moment as we close. Jesus, thank you that you loved us so much that you thought us worth dying for. You paid the highest price. You didn't want us stuck in this cycle of sin where we had to work our way to feel worthy. We don't have to do that anymore. Instead, you took our place on the cross to make us worthy, to give us new life, a hope and a future. And Father, I just ask if there's anyone watching this who just feels broken, and they might know you, but they just don't really experience or feel any of the things that they hear about you. Holy Spirit, I just pray you would come and fill people's lives afresh, that we would once again just trust you. We believe that what you've done on the cross has brought us freedom, and Holy Spirit, would we experience that right now? That anxiety would go, that a low self of esteem would go, that feeling of not being good enough or that we'll never amount to anything would go, because as your word says, we are children of God, and you have amazing plans and purposes for us. We love you, Jesus.